Okay everyone, this is just a quick video to show you the best settings, parameters, some editing in the .cfg file, the NVIDIA control panel, Intel power options, things like that that can get you better FPS. Okay, so let's start off going through the basic settings in the in-game Arma menu. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is go through and tell you which of these are CPU dependent, which one are GPU dependent, so you can kind of base what you want them to be on your system specs. If you have a higher end GPU, you can increase the settings that are GPU dependent, and vice versa with the CPU. So sampling, that's going to be both. That's just how many it's the resolution that it's rendering. If you have a very high-end GPU, such as a GTX 1080 Ti, you can go ahead and increase this beyond 100 to fully utilize your graphics card. It will increase looks a little bit, not worth it though, unless you have an amazing graphics card. Okay, and texture, it is storage slash graphics card dependent. Objects are dependent on both CPU and GPU. Terrain, also CPU slash GPU. Shadows, that is mainly GPU. Particles, that's mainly GPU as well. And so are clouds and picture-in-picture. And now texturing. Texture, you're going to want on around high to ultra. That gives you the best looks versus performance. It's not a huge performance drop, but it is noticeable, going from high to ultra. Once you get to high, it'll stop building pop-in, which is common among the lower settings. Ultra basically eliminates it if that's a problem for you. Objects, that reduces object pop-in, but it will decrease frame rate. You're probably going to want to have this on between high and ultra. On terrain, you're probably going to want to have this between standard to high. Anything past high, such as very high and ultra, there's not a huge difference in how it looks, not a huge improvement, but it does decrease frame rate. Now shadows. Shadows are either CPU or GPU dependent. If you have them on low or standard, it places the responsibility on the CPU, which you do not want because Arma does not utilize the CPU very well. You're either going to want to have this on disabled or ultra. From my personal experience, ultra seems to actually have better performance than disabled. Now onto particles. You're probably going to want to have this on low to standard. There's not a huge difference in how it looks, with explosions, dust from a helicopter, things like that. Not a huge difference between low and standard and high. I keep mine on standard. There's not a huge performance decrease, but I would stay away from high and just keep it on standard because it does not look any different. Now clouds, once again, clouds are GPU dependent. You probably want to put them on low. If anything, that will just help you spot aircraft easier if your render distance is actually high enough to see them. There is a slight performance loss, but it is not significant. The only reason I would suggest going above low is if you are into flying and you want the sky to be pretty. Okay, now picture-in-picture quality. You're going to want to have this on low or disabled. What this is the reflective surface inside of a truck or a helicopter. The mirror is placed on the side and the front. It allows you to see stuff behind you, but that does use the GPU more than is necessary for very little gain. Actually, in-game, you're never going to use this setting. You're almost always going to be in third person unless you're in a hardcore server, in which case you're probably just going to turn your head. So you're going to want to keep that on disabled. Now onto lighting. For HDR, high dynamic range, that increases the contrast, the colors. It just makes it look a lot prettier. For a very slight performance decrease, I would recommend that to standard just because I like the way it looks. It's less dark, it's less yellow, just overall looks so much better. Dynamic lights, you can set that to anything you want. This is mainly personal preference. There is very little performance decrease no matter what you click. I set mine on ultra just because I can. Okay, now onto water reflections. You're probably going to want to have this on disabled. It's not very useful in game, regardless of its performance impact. You're never going to need to see the reflections off of lighting. It's just for looks, but you can increase it. It is GPU dependent, and it will slightly decrease performance, not enough to notice, honestly. Put that on what you like. I prefer disabled. Now onto render distance. Render distance is dependent on the CPU, the storage, and the GPU, obviously because it's referencing all these over here. Those all play a factor in render distance. For overall, I recommend between 1600 and 2150, but you will be changing this in combat. Say, if you get into an aircraft, you're going to want to increase it. If you get into a car, you're going to want to increase it if you're gunning. On foot, if you're a sniper, you're going to want to increase it. But if you're going through a town, like in King of the Hill, or you're playing Wasteland and you're infiltrating a building, a town, you might want to lower that so you have higher FPS. There are distance correspondence to, let's say, low or higher ultra that I have found someone has tested. Say, for instance, if you have a low end, most of these settings are on low, you're going to want to put your overall on 1050 meters. Standard, about 1600 meters. High, 2150 meters. Very high, 2700 meters. And ultra, 3800 meters. On object render distance, low is equal to about 860 meters, standard is equal to about 1100 meters, high is equal to about 1350 meters, very high is equal to 1600 meters, and ultra is equal to 2100 meters. I prefer object to match the overall, but that is just personal preference. You can decrease it to increase performance, and etc. Shadow distance I would recommend to 100 or 0, or 50 I guess. Shadows will decrease performance slightly, especially if you have your ambient occlusion settings turned up to high, but it's not a huge impact, so I would just leave it on 100. Now on to display. Display mode, that's pretty much user preference. I prefer full screen windowed because I have a second monitor that is often on Google, YouTube, etc. And if it was full screen instead of windowed, I would have a lot of trouble navigating between monitors. You know, every time I clicked on the second monitor, this screen would minimize, etc. If you're on full screen and you're transferring between windows, or even alt-escaping, alt-tabbing to your desktop, or to Google, Chrome, YouTube, whatever, there is a chance that you will crash. You'll get a black screen when you try to join back. I've had these problems, especially on my laptop, trying to play King of the Hill, alt-tabbing out to use Chrome, etc. So I pretty much always recommend this to full screen windowed, but it will decrease performance slightly because it's loading the desktop in the background. So if you have a extremely low-end computer, full screen might increase performance a little bit, but I always recommend full screen windowed. Resolution and aspect ratio, of course, need to match your native resolution and aspect ratio. VSync, of course, you want disabled unless you have a very high-end computer that is constantly achieving over 60 frames per second and you do not have a G-Sync monitor. If you have that set up, there's a pretty good chance you can experience screen tearing, which is pretty awful, and this will minimize that, but it will also increase input lag. So I recommend getting a G-Sync monitor if you happen to be experiencing this. I am currently using the Asus 144Hz VG28QE, something like that, with G-Sync, and it is amazing. Interface size, of course, personal preference, as well as brightness and gamma. One drawback to a full screen window, though, is that you can't adjust gamma. One particular instance in which this is not favorable is like when you're playing a server it's currently nighttime, you don't have night vision, etc. Gamma is often a great way to get the edge up or to actually see in the dark without night vision. It's almost cheating. In some servers, it is restricted where you can't change it just to stop that, but in other servers it is not. Brightness, of course, is just how it looks. All the way is too high. Down low is just a little too dark. A mixture of about right here is where I prefer it, but of course, up to you. Now on to anti-aliasing and post-processing. All of these right here, of course, are a personal preference. That is bloom, blur, fill, sharpen, filter. That is all personal preference. Bloom is the glow of light. You can see that in the background behind me. I prefer that on 0. That's just gonna decrease how well you can see. Radial blur and rotational blur. That's just different variations of blur that occurs when you are moving and when objects around you are moving. I recommend turning this off because it looks terrible and it just ruins the game. Depth of field is the blurring of objects out of focus. You can read that there, of course. Such as, if I'm aiming at a helicopter 20 feet in front of me, the building 100 feet from me will be blurred out. Sharpen filter, of course, that is also user preference. Too low makes everything look soft and blurry. Too high makes everything look a little too crisp, if that makes sense. The default 100 it seems to be a pretty good balance. Now on to ambient occlusion. And once again, everything on this screen right here is GPU dependent. Ambient occlusion adds realistic light behavior and shadows on bushes, objects, people, pretty much everything. It works along with the shadow setting. If you have that disabled, that will affect how ambient occlusion works. But for the most part, you're going to want to set this to low if you need more performance. As you can see, it took away many shadows and the way the light was reflecting. I, however, prefer how it looks. I prefer my game to look very pretty and beautiful, so I set this to high. That is up to you. Down here, decreases performance but increases looks, vice versa up here. Caustics, reflected light rays. That's almost never going to be useful. If anything, it will only ever decrease performance. Not much, but it's not useful at all, so just go ahead and disable that. Brightness, contrast, saturation, all this of course is up to you. It doesn't make a difference one way or the other, just affects how everything looks with no performance impacts. Now onto full screen anti-aliasing. This smoothens the edges of objects and is especially useful on 1080p monitors. Once you get to 1440p, 2160, it starts becoming less useful. It's less noticeable when there's that many pixels together. I recommend 2 to 4 times for increased looks. You won't notice it much if it's disabled, but you will notice it occasionally, and for myself, it really tends to bother me. I have it on 4. 8 times is a bit much. There's not a huge difference between 4 and 8. I recommend 4, but you can set disabled if you need slightly increased performance. ATOC, alpha coverage, I would recommend disabled or grass only. It kind of gets rid of the jagged edges on foliage that you might notice sometimes. It does make the grass look better, I think. Trees, less noticeable. If anything, it looks like the sharpness has been decreased on trees, which I kind of prefer it to be increased. That is up to you, though it will decrease performance slightly if you pick trees or grass instead of disabled. Post-process anti-aliasing, this is up to you. There's a ton of different choices. I recommend reading up on them to figure out what is best for you. But to sum it up, mostly FX and CM will have the biggest performance impact, but SMAA, in my opinion, looks the best and also has the least impact on performance, except of course for disabled. Post-process anti-aliasing is also a good alternative if you have full-screen anti-aliasing disabled and you want a similar visual appeal. Anisotropic filtering. Anisotropic filtering, I recommend setting to high or ultra. There is not a huge performance impact one way or the other, and turning it to disabled makes everything seem blurry in the background, which reduces the impact of all the other settings that we have set to make it look good. And once again, there's very little impact between these two options. Once again, you can see the FPS I'm getting standing right here in the crease of this rock. You spawn in right there when you start this mission. I'm just aiming at the helicopter with the dust flying off of it. I'm getting about 80 to 95 FPS, somewhere in that area, just staring right at the helicopter, standing still. Now let's move on to launcher parameters to see what we can do to increase performance from that angle. So on here, what you want to do is set the platform to 64-bit, unless of course you have a 32-bit computer, which in that case I recommend switching to a new computer. The new 64-bit update is extremely helpful in increasing performance in Arma 3. It may not increase the overall, let's say, average FPS, but it will decrease many lag stutters, such as when you're turning, because it allows the system to use more of its memory to store the terrain and everything you've loaded around you. These settings right here, you'll notice several settings that I have checked that I won't talk about. Those either have little effect and are just personal preference, or such as these, they decrease loading time and FPS at the main menu, which is not what we're talking about. So the first thing you want to do is set your CPU count to the number of cores your CPU has. That is not logical cores, that is not threads, that is a number of physical cores. I have an i7-7700K, so my processor has 4 cores and a total of 8 threads. Now on to extra threads. This will allow Arma 3 to use more of the processor's threads and resources, which will overall increase performance slightly. If your processor supports it, I know most Intel Core i7 processors support hyper-threading, and some i7s don't for some reason, and possibly some i5s support it. I'm not sure about AMD, but you need to look up your specific CPU and see if it supports hyper-threading. If it does, turn this on, or even just turn it on anyways. If it doesn't support it, it probably won't use it. This can only increase performance. It allows the processor, similar to extra threads, to use more of what the CPU has. Now on to memory allocator. On 32-bit Arma, this actually made a difference, and especially on the very early versions of Arma 3, this made a big difference. But now it seems to have very little impact, and I honestly can't notice a difference between the one I used to use and the default. I keep it on the one I'm used to using, but honestly, it makes almost no difference. You'll also want to enable large page support. This allows applications to establish large page memory regions, which is particularly useful in 64-bit. Just basically it allows the processor to be utilized more, just like before. All these just increase performance a little bit, not much. On system memory limit, you probably don't need to enable this on many 64-bit computers. Arma 3 is probably already going to use as much memory as it needs, but I went ahead and checked it, set it to what I wanted to use as max. This gives me a little bit of free room in case Arma does, for some reason, have uses all these resources. Perhaps there's a memory leak of something like that. I will still have some memory left, and it won't crash my computer. And it will also ensure that it will use up to this and won't stop at, for example, the 32-bit limit, which was 2 gigabytes, which could be enabled up to 3 gigabytes. Onto video memory limit. This is the VRAM that your graphics card supports. I have a GTX 1070, so mine is 8 gigabytes. So I want to set that to 8,192 megabytes. You're going to want to look up your graphics card and set this to what the VRAM of your graphics card is. And you'll also want to set this just a few gigabytes less than the max memory you have in your computer, just to ensure that you have a little bit of wiggle room and that your computer won't crash if it does happen to use this much. Enable file patching. That will increase performance a little bit, but every server I've tried to join has restricted this from being enabled for some reason, so do not enable this. That's pretty much it for the parameters that you can go through. This is kind of the client, the host, just other stuff you can use on Arma that will have no effect whatsoever on performance in game. The next thing I want to move on to is editing the Arma 3 CFG or the configuration file. To get to this, you're going to want to go to your Documents, Arma 3, Users, and whatever the name of your profile is. You're going to go down to Arma 3 CFG and open it in Notepad, TextPad, Word, whatever text editor you have. Now you're going to want to find GPU max frames ahead and GPU detected frames ahead. On GPU max frames ahead, you're going to want to set that to 1 to decrease like latency and like mouse input lag, but that will also decrease performance slightly because it's rendering less frames ahead of time. But I believe that decreased latency is always more important than frames. The same thing with GPU detected frames ahead. You're going to want to set that to 1 or 0, pretty much the same impact as the other one. Okay, the next thing you want to go to is refresh equals to 120. This won't be particularly useful unless you're achieving way over 60 frames constantly, if you have VSync enabled, etc. And this .cfg file also has all the settings that we just changed in-game. So if you want to go ahead and set this file to read only, that will change Arma 3's ability to change the file, so you will always have the same settings. One thing to mention, I've recently changed my CPU from a 6700K to a 7700K, but even before then, my frequency was higher than this. So if you want to change the frequency that it detects to what your frequency actually is, which my 7700K is currently set at 4800 megahertz, just go through and set whatever yours is currently at. For some reason, it says detected CPU cores is equal to 8. Don't know why that is. I'm not going to worry about it, and I recommend you don't either. Also, you'll want to make sure that your Arma, like mine just was, is not open when you're editing the file. That will either prevent you from opening it, editing it, saving it, etc., or just completely mess up your game in some way. I don't know, but make sure your game's closed before editing the file. The next thing I want to touch on is the NVIDIA control panel. You want to find configure surround physics, and you want to set physics to use the graphics card and not the CPU. That will increase performance because Arma is not optimized for a CPU, so you don't want it using it. And it will also take the load off of the CPU. Now you want to go to adjust image settings with preview. Set it to use your advanced 3D image settings. Now you want to manage those 3D settings that you just set it to use. You'll pretty much want to set it to what I have here. The most important things I would say are putting everything on application controlled or off/prefer performance, unless you read the description and think that you want it or need it. Some things worth mentioning that are pretty important is performing maximum performance and power management, single display performance mode, and setting your pre-rendered frames to 1 as well as your virtual reality pre-rendered frames. This once again will decrease input lag/latency, but at the cost of a reduced frame rate, which in my personal opinion is more important. You'll also want to go through, especially if you're on a laptop, is go through your Intel power options, make sure everything's set to prefer maximum performance, and that all battery saving settings have been turned off. So here's the intro for the very first mission. If you want to go through and compare FPS from what you're getting to what I'm getting.
What's the deal with the roads? Why the lockdown? Somebody forgot to tell the AAF commander we'd be decommissioning the airbase. He's throwing some kind of hissy fit over there right now. It's a mess. So you'd think the greenbacks were actually competent or something? I wouldn't go that far. Hey, check out Maxwell. There's a helo. Didn't we finish with that place already? Guess not. Then again, Command doesn't really seem to know or particularly care what's going on. Part of me can't really blame them. My 2-6 sure looks quiet. Yeah, most of the guys have shipped out already. Just us lucky few left doing the monkey work, huh? You'd rather be on a boat in the Pacific, huh, Sergeant? I'd rather be the hell off this rock, sir. I see LZ Baldy's packed up. Nice. At this rate, we might even get out of here in, 20 years. Greenbacks wouldn't stand for that shit, Lazy. They've had to stick up their ass about Baldy for weeks now. Yeah? Well, they can respectfully go fuck themselves, sir. We didn't butcher half our own population, and I sure as hell didn't ask to be on their pissant island. Well, ain't that just half the problem? I thought the roads were closed. They are. Well, why is there a truck leaving Rogaine? Good question. No idea. Maybe something important? Alright, guys. I'm going to turn us around before bringing us in. Try not to fall off. Thanks for flying. Please disembark in an orderly fashion. Gary, go check in with the lieutenant over there. He runs the show here at Rogaine. Lacey, I don't know.
So here's just some footage of some King of the Hill if you want to compare FPS. Here are my in-game render settings, and once again my graphic settings. Let's try that again. Once again, let's try this again. Toe for the Gopher, can you please paradrop us? So that's pretty much it. I'm pretty sure I included everything that could possibly affect performance. One thing worth mentioning is that the best thing you can do to increase performance overall, more important than any in-game setting, anything you can change with your NVIDIA settings, anything like that, is keeping a clean operating system. You know, limit the amount of programs you have running in the background, or just the programs you have in general. And it really doesn't hurt. It actually really helps to reset your operating system like once a month or every 2 months or something like that. You know, keep a backup, keep an external hard drive, or just on a second hard drive, keep your games, your Steam games, everything like that. Or copy them to them before you reset, and then just reset your operating system, reinstall it. Also, not related to Armor performance, but just something pretty useful. When you're installing an operating system such as Windows 10 onto a hard drive, make sure you only have that single hard drive in the computer. If you have more than one, then the hard drive that you're not installing the operating system to will receive the system partition, you know, that contains the boot info. Therefore, if you ever removed that second hard drive and you tried to boot up, you would not be able to, even though the operating system is on that single hard drive. Well, I think that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. If I left out any tips, anything I'd said wrong, anything you might find useful, please just include those as a comment. Any improvements I will put in the description or as annotations in the video. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching.